Okay, I feel almost redundant, actually. In a way, all I'm going to do is fill in a few of those dots in what Patricia was talking about, and certainly I'm not going to be able to match the inspiration that we had this morning from the President. But hopefully what I'm going to say fills in a few dots, tells you a little bit about what is happening in some workplaces in Ireland today. I think I've got about 35 minutes. Am I right, Michael? Okay, off we go. I want to start off by talking about why better jobs matter, why we should think about what sort of jobs there are rather than just how many there are. Then I'm going to talk about occupations, the way the occupational structure of society has been changing. Then I'm going to look at what's been happening in Ireland in particular. And then comes the meat of the presentation, where I'm looking at what's actually happening in Irish workplaces, some Irish workplaces, in the hospitality sector, in the construction sector, and in financial services and ICT. And it'll become clear during the talk why we're looking at those three to four sectors. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about how we should move from, how we have moved from voluntary to imposed flexibility, and some ways in which we might be able to get control back over work in the workplace. Now, I should say before I go on that this is meant to be a two-people talk, because my colleague Alicja Bodek was meant to do the middle bit, the hospitality, construction, the case and financial services. But for personal reasons, Alicja can't be with us, so I'm going to be a rather cheap, inferior substitute for actually the core of the presentation. So I hope you'll excuse that. Right, why better jobs matter. We talked a little bit this morning already about returning to growth as a political imperative in Europe. And the issue that has been put on the table already is we don't just need growth, we need to think about what sort of growth. I think there are some rather different arguments here. For Social Democrats, there are really two things. We want less inequality, and that means raising wages at the bottom, because we want a more equal society. I think what defines the social democratic position is, if you like, the equality option. We want as much equality as is possible, compatible with individual freedom. But we are also concerned with the quality of employment, because work, and actually the President was talking about this, work is not just a way of getting money. It's one of the ways in which we become part of society. It's one of the ways in which we become citizens of society. And there's another issue about the sort of recovery, which we haven't talked about today really, though it's kind of lurking there. And next year, I hope that TASC will address this one head on, which is the little matter of the environment. If we have the same sort of growth as we had 10 years ago, we are guaranteeing ourselves an ecological catastrophe. The ETUI has put up the very good slogan, there's no jobs on a dead planet. And I think from a progressive perspective, what matters is putting together the issue of social justice with the environmental issue, because contrary to what many people think, they are not the same. It's not automatic that they're compatible. So I think there's a lot of work to do there, and I'm afraid we're not even going to talk about it today. Let me think now a little bit about occupations, job quality, and working conditions. Why should we think about occupations? Well, this chart, I think, tells you why. This is looking at which occupations have been growing. It's UK data from way before the crisis, 1979-99. And it's one of the first signs of this hollowing out process that Patricia has already mentioned. Not everywhere, and not in all countries, and not at all times, but there is a clear general trend for jobs to be growing at the top. That's up there. And jobs to be growing, often to a lesser extent, down there. And jobs to be being lost in the middle down here. The growth of, if you like, lovely jobs and lousy jobs. What that means is that the occupational structure of the society is changing. Way back when I was a bright and sprightly young thing, and some of you weren't even born, we thought that society looked like that. It was a pyramid. There were lots of people at the bottom, not so many people in the middle, and there were very few privileged people up there in the top. That was the 1950s. And then the world got, if you like, better, because society became like a diamond, in the simple sense that there were more jobs being created in the middle range. But I'm afraid, people, that isn't where we are now. In many ways, we are now living in an hourglass society, a hollowed-out society where there's lots of jobs at the bottom and there's jobs at the top, but less in the middle. If that is what is happening, what is actually happening to occupations, both to the numbers of occupations and within them? Well, if that is our hourglass, the first thing that is probably happening, if it's becoming like an hourglass, is that there is growth at the bottom. As I've already said, there are more bad jobs. More bad jobs and more jobs with very low pay. And bad in other ways that we'll come to in a minute. The next thing that may be happening, and one would logically expect it to be happening, is that the middle is being squeezed. In other words, jobs in the middle are being degenerated. They are being pushed down in all sorts of ways. But cheer up. We would also expect growth at the top. In other words, more jobs, and notice that big arrow going up, some few people getting very, very high levels of rewards. That's not what is necessarily happening, but that's the sort of thing that should be happening, or would be happening, if we were having a moving towards an hourglass society. And I want you to bear those images and those processes in mind, because that is actually what is dictating the way we went at our particular research. But before I get to that, I need to talk a little bit about Ireland itself. Because what we want to think about is what's happening to the occupational structure and to the nature of jobs in Ireland. Now, I think we all know, but it's worth reminding ourselves that Ireland is a very peculiar place. It's very peculiar, and David's already said this, because compared to other small European economies, which are focused on exports and which are relatively affluent, it has a long-term focus on FDI. And that goes right back to the Whittaker Report in 1958, the absolutely unshakable policy commitment of this country to develop, for economic development on mobile foreign direct investment. And probably most people in the room know the history of that, starting off with almost screwdriver assembly plants in the 1960s and 1970s, moving on through higher technology manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. Now, today, it involves high-tech manufacturing, so Intel, et cetera, the pharma sector, software and internet companies, the beloved Google, but also, interestingly, financial services and in the IFSC, the so-called new fintech sector. And in a way, the bubble of 2004 to 2008, the construction bubble, was a mad but unusual moment in Irish economic history, because it was a deviation from this absolutely rock-solid commitment. And let's be clear, it's worked. You may not like some aspects of it, but it's worked. That is what has driven the growth in the economy for the last 50, 60 years. And we'll see some of the implications of that in a minute. In terms of occupations, it has also was partly responsible for the fact that in the early part of this century, there were very, very clear growth at the top end, if you like, in high-skilled jobs. There was some evidence of jobs growing at the bottom, and there's a debate in researchers amongst this. O'Connell and Russell from the SRI talk about a limited polarization in that period. There's some papers from people at the Scope Centre in the UK who go exactly the other way around and talk about Ireland in that period as an extreme case of high skill growth within Europe. In the crisis, remember that jobs were maintained and even in many subsectors actually grew in high-tech manufacturing and internet services. Now that actually says something really, really important about austerity policies. And I'm not being original here, my colleague Aidan Regan has really nailed this one. The real cause of the recovery that we have in Ireland today has got absolutely nothing to do with austerity policies. They haven't managed to stop it, is about all one can say. Because the core cause of that recovery has been the maintenance of that FDI sector. But, at the same time, there is a dark side. And it's a big dark side because it's the growth in the crisis of low-pay jobs. And the European Foundation's latest work in its job monitor shows very clear evidence of employment polarization in Ireland in very recent period. So what we have in Ireland now is what I call creeping inequality. If you look at earnings and market income before tax and before transfers, Ireland is an extreme case within the OECD. There we are there, the bad boys in the class. And it's important to remember this one because this is what defines in many ways the Irish social structure. That before transfers, we have the highest level of low pay. Sorry, low pay is coming on the next slide. I've got too many slides in front of me. This is the Gini coefficient. Sorry, absolute rubbish. Cancel what I said for the last minute. Let me rework it. That's the Gini coefficient, which we all know and love, and it shows before tax, before transfers, we are the bad boys. Now, once you put in social transfers, once you put in tax, Ireland becomes boring. It's just a sort of normal middle European society. But the underlying reality, the state has to work incredibly hard to clear up that mess. And the right-hand slide shows us, the right-hand chart over there, shows us the way inequality has grown. Lying underneath that, part of that is low pay, and Ireland there is one of the highest, has one of the highest rates, of low pay in all OECD countries. I mean, for God's sake, only America gets worse than us. You know, and anybody who knows anything knows that if you're at American standards of low pay and income inequality, you know, you really, really, really have got somewhere. The level of the incidence of low pay seems to have been growing generally in the OECD, or is at least stagnant. It's certainly been going up in the last couple of years. But don't worry, we've been increasing it for longer. The level of low pay in Ireland has been going up for some time. Against that background, we carried out our research looking at what was going on in workplaces in 4 case study sectors. We chose, first of all, the red line, which is the construction sector. This is actually where we think the middle is being squeezed. We chose also the purple line, or mauve. My wife always says I'm colorblind, but it's that line there anyway, which is the hospitality sector, because that is where, as Patricia's already said, is one of the key locuses of low pay. And then we also chose 2 areas where it looks at least as if there is high pay and good work. Here, finance, insurance, and real estate, and down here, IT and communications. Those are the absolute numbers involved. Before we go on, notice the shapes. Look what happens to construction. Goes from over 250,000 down to, at the bottom, less than 100,000 people. in just a couple of years. Now, construction industries the world over fluctuate, but this, I think, is pretty unprecedented in global terms. It certainly marks construction out from any other sector of employment in Ireland. Notice the other way around, as I mentioned, that the good jobs, where we think there are good jobs, have actually been at least stagnant or even growing through the crisis. Okay, let's get on to the meat. Going to look first of all at hospitality. Now, I should say what we did. This, we're using sort of the normal statistics, largely the quarterly national household survey, some earnings data, but the key thing that we did was quite simply we went and talked to people. And I think I would put in a plug here. This is what sociologists do. We do believe that people exist. Economists, I think, I'm not quite sure about that ontological issue. So we actually went and interviewed people. We didn't do it through a survey. I was being very angry with somebody who said to me, you did a survey. No, we didn't do a survey. We did long qualitative interviews with people, very carefully targeted we looked for people in different occupations in different places, and we did hour-and-a-half long interviews with people, which we transcribed and went over backwards and forwards, and we come up with some hopefully useful idea of what's going on. Okay, in the hospitality sector. First of all, some numbers. This is an area where there are, as you know, lots and lots of people in part-time work. The crucial point is that as employment has begun to recover a bit, the number of people who are in part-time has, if anything, increased. The proportion, remains an area of part-time work. And as Patricia's already mentioned, as we'll see in a minute, part-time doesn't just mean part-time because you only want to work part-time. It often is various forms of constrained part-time. This is a sector which has a low-paid workforce and lots of casual jobs before the recession. As I've already said, the number of part-time jobs is growing. Interestingly, and Michelle has done quite a lot of work on this and may even talk about it, there's a lot of jobs that are not quite full-time, they're not part-time, they're something in between. And part of the reason for that is the extent of contracts that are not zero-hour contracts, but are so-called if and when contracts. You don't know what your hours are not guaranteed. There is an idea that you will be flexible, not the employer. And in theory, if you're offered hours that you don't like, you can refuse them. But I'm sorry, it's not like that. It's quite straightforward. If you don't take the hours that you're asked to take, you won't be offered so good hours next week, or you won't be offered any hours at all. Using hours as a way of controlling the workforce is now absolutely standard. Economists like to think that an hour has 60 minutes in it. And so we can talk about hourly rates of pay. We have discovered the rather alarming fact that Irish employers are not convinced of this. There is actually a changing social definition of what an hour is. You are paid to do 4 hours work. In an evening, you finish up, but then you stay on another 2 hours to clear up. You're not actually paid for it, mind you. So the 4 hours has magically become 6 hours, though your pay slip will still show 4 hours, if you have a pay slip, mind you. So the hour itself has become flexible to the benefit of the employer. So as I've been saying, this is a sector where hours, shifts, and hence income are unpredictable. This is one of our interview quotes. I'm going to read some of our interview quotes to you. The interviewee says, they, the managers, write on the roster. They write, for example, start at 8 a.m. and finish at 3 p.m. But the next day you come and you see that you have to work till 5 p.m., not 3 p.m. You never know. You can't plan anything. And now it's even worse because they put the roster on the wall the last day on Sunday. They put the roster on the wall. So, for example, if you have Monday your day off, you can't make any plan because you didn't know that tomorrow you'll have a day off. And the interviewer says, well, how much do you get per week? And she says, well, 200, 300, 400. It depends. And the interviewee says, well, how can you plan financially? And she says, well, you can't make any plan. You live in that hotel. All your life is in that hotel because you don't know. You just have to go to the hotel. That's all. This is flexibility, but flexibility imposed by employers. The implications of these sorts of contracts and these sorts of conditions are that earnings in the Irish hospitality sector, average earnings, are actually lower than what you would get if you were paid the national minimum wage and worked for 39 hours. This is low pay. Not just low pay, but flexibility as a requirement. Shifts are assigned, as we've already seen from that interview quote, at the last minute. There is a minimum hourly rate that's totally legal, but it generates an unpredictable income. And notice all sorts of complications that result from this situation. For example, you can't go and get another job to top up that income because you never know when you're going to have to go to work or how long you're going to have to stay there for. It creates all sorts of tangles with social welfare entitlements and benefit entitlements. And crucially, working time, as I've already said, becomes itself a way in which employers control their employees. It's a way in which, in particular, frontline supervisors control their immediate workforce. In the report, we talk about some other implications of this, in particular some new forms or newly noticed forms of health and safety issues. But I think should move on to the next, where we look at construction. Now, construction is obviously a very, very different sort of workplace. To start with, it's overwhelmingly male. About 95% of the workforce is male. Incidentally, when we campaign for gender equality, we love having politically correct posters of female engineers, and there are on site with helmets on. There are a few of those people, but the real women working in this industry are, in fact, the delightful category of relatives assisting. That's actually the wife doing the accounts in small firms. Okay, let's look at what goes on in construction. I've already drawn your attention to this incredible rise through the boom and bubble and then collapse. But within that, there are some very interesting shifts in who is actually working and the way in which they're working. Patricia's already flagged this, but let's develop it a little bit. The green line is employees. These are people who are paid wages, working, paying PAYE, etc., etc. The blue line is the self-employed. And you notice that if you take self-employed overall, they more or less go in parallel with the employees. But within the self-employed, something very interesting is happening. Because these people here are self-employed without any employees, right? These are the sort of one-man band, if you like. And the point of the story is that now there are nearly as many, these are index figures, there are nearly as many of these people now as there were at the height of the boom, in absolute numbers, let alone percentages. So what that means is that the composition of the workforce has been changing. There's not just a lot of people being self-employed, but there are more people who are self-employed without employees. And this is where you have bogus self-employment. We did a detailed analysis of this, and out there, which you can also take, as well as the big fat book, there's a little brochure that we did looking in particular at self-employment. Self-employment has always been important. As I've said, it's risen since 2008. Now, the thing that goes on here is something called the relevant contracts tax. The RCT system facilitates, it doesn't cause it, but it facilitates it. And what has actually happened here is that the government, in its wisdom, has designed a tax system that encourages tax evasion and that encourages people to be self-employed, whether they want to be or not. essentially, and you can just look up, Google RCT and look this up on the web yourself. If I'm an employer and you come to me and look for a job, I say, yeah, sure, of course I've got a job for you. Great. When do you start? Start tomorrow. Okay, fine. I'll just declare you self-employed. I fill in a form on the web, give me your PPS number, and that's all I need. You don't even have to say, yes, I agree. It's just declared. There are, of course, 2 points on this form, which it's just like buying books on Amazon. You have to tick. And there are 2 places where you tick on this form, and it says, I certify that this is not a labour-only contract. Now, a labour-only contract means that you're just working essentially without any equipment of your own. You don't employ people. You're just working with your hands, essentially. And I'm certifying that, no, it's not that. Really, you are genuinely self-employed. But I mean, you know, they just tick it. They just tick it. They just tick it. Like, have you ever read the terms and conditions for Amazon? Have you ever read the terms and conditions for buying a flight with Ryanair? Of course you never have. Somebody worked out that if you did that, if you read all the terms and conditions on internet purchases, you could actually spend your whole week doing nothing else than reading those terms and conditions. These terms and these tick boxes are exactly the same. They're there for ornament. So what we have is a tax system that allows employers to define employees as not really employees at all. There's obvious benefits for the employer for the very simple reason the employer doesn't pay any employer's PRSI. Also gets out of all sorts of other things, though it becomes a little bit dodgy the extent to which that actually occurs. The government loses PRSI revenue. Obviously, the self-employed person should pay more PRSI contributions themselves, and in fact it's a higher rate than for employees, but it doesn't cancel out the combination of the loss of the combination of employees' PRSI plus employers' PRSI. So we reckon that the state has brilliantly managed to lose at least 20 million a year, but it's probably a multiple of that, and that's not tax, that's PRSI contributions. This is what is happening to large numbers of workers in the skilled trades in the building sector. What's been happening to general operatives and labourers is rather different. What we found there is the growth of agency workers, all sorts of different forms of agency work, some very respectable, some getting pretty illegal and quite scary, and you don't really want to meet these people. There are less and less people who are actually employed directly by the big company. So that if you look on any of the building sites that we're beginning to see again, and it says CISC or Radigans or all of these people on the cranes, and you think, well, everybody there must be employed by them. Sorry, they're not. Probably on a normal building site, about 10 people are actually employed on the site by the lead contractor. Everybody else is employed by a subcontractor, who's employed by a subcontractor, employed by a subcontractor, and actually is self-employed, or works for an agency. So the firm has, if you like, been hollowed out. Here's another interview quote. Our interviewee says, yeah, I'm working for them. He names a large firm. But I'm a subcontractor to a subcontractor. It's bogus subcontracting, in essence, which is encouraged by the revenue commissioners. Subcontractors cover themselves by telling your details to them, and he says X is on a relevant contract, and the revenue commissioners acknowledge that and sends me out a slip to say that you are on that contract. This is a bricklayer talking. So he's just describing how he's made to be self-employed. Self-employment, in this form, we call it bogus self-employment.
As regards the RCT contract, just to very quickly say, I've actually talked to James about this, but just to explain to people what it actually involves in an RCT, I have here a document from a recruitment agency, and this is and what it actually says is the advantages of using CLS. No PRSI to pay 10.75%, no holiday pay 8%, no pension to pay 10 to 12%, no holidays to pay, no sick leave, no redundancy, no disputes with employees, unfair dismissals, ability to both hire and off-hire staff at 1 hour's notice throughout the country. So that's what's happening in building sites, and that's why employers will put people on an RCT. But just, James, with some of the financial figures that you've come up with, and we've talked about this before, and again, I've got to disagree with you. We believe that the loss to the state has been in the billions, not millions, billions. Since 2000, from 2008 to 2014, through parliamentary questions, we actually got the tax figures for RCT. It comes in at minus. Yes, that's minus 90 million euro. So I believe there might be a couple of economists here today that maybe could explain that to me, because I can't understand that, how you can have a minus tax figure. Between 2000 and 2014, the total net tax from RCT came in at 400 million. This includes the biggest boom in the history of the universe, and they were left with 400 million euro, which was scandalous. Now, James, I think you would agree that the RCT was designed by people in the revenue. It cannot operate without them. This is state-sponsored fraud on the rest of the country. It's state-sponsored abuse of building workers. And there are people very high up, either at political level or civil service level, in the revenue commissioners, that have some very serious questions to answer here. And unfortunately, we've went to ministers in the last government, and they just simply were not willing to act. So I'd like your thoughts, James. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ken. I very carefully didn't talk about tax. I talked about insurance, PRSI. The point is that, okay, the figures that you gave are absolutely correct, but probably I certainly don't pretend to understand how that is happening, right? What we do know, and which is absolutely clear, is that there is a significant loss in terms of PRSI. I think it's a separate issue, and probably a much bigger issue about the loss of tax. But that's something we haven't discussed in the report, because quite honestly, I don't understand how it works. So I'm not disputing your figures. I'm just saying I'm focusing on the things that I'm sure about.
Where my economist had to say we're very good at coming up with schemes that give you minus figures for tax. They tend not to apply to ordinary people. They tend to apply to big companies and firms and so on as well. Another question down here, yes.
Thanks very much. My name is Anne-Marie McGarren from the National Economic and Social Council, and I'd like to thank the two speakers for their very interesting presentations on how we have lower pay and lower hours. But I wanted to ask Patricia about one thing that she had referred to in her presentation in the public sector, how since the agreements made during the crisis that actually we don't have lower hours but we have higher hours, and that this is very unpopular with many of all the members of the public sector and trade union members as well. And I know that the various agreements are up for being renegotiated. And I wonder if IC2 has done any work to find out how much its members want to have an emphasis on more pay or lower hours. And also if the union is planning to look at that issue, or is it just concentrating on the pay issue? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, just to maybe correct, in case I put that point across, there are low-hour contracts in the public sector which are problems as well. There are in particular parts of it in the healthcare sector, in education at some levels of it. So low-hour contracts are an issue in the public sector as well. But to move on to the substantive question you asked, I think that there is an issue for some groups at least in the public sector. Probably at the higher pay levels, there would be an accepted pattern of work that people at the higher paid levels would work hours, if you understand, commensurate with their pay, which is not necessarily strictly within a set band of hours. That has been along, particularly at the higher level. But in the main, the Public Services Committee of Congress, as we speak, are in the process of consultation with all of the trade unions within the public sector. And within that consultation, they are hearing from those unions what the main issues are relating to the current agreement and indeed the previous agreements, and where public servants, this is a consultation process just to establish and anchor what are the main points that public servants want and need to be progressed in any further engagement with the government. So I think it would be no surprise that the extension of hours for public servants will feature as an issue in that. I would say that that is being mentioned in more than one room. Now, it might be that certain categories of workers over others mention it more often, and I'm sure you could even work out yourself, Anne-Marie, where that would come from and so on. But there certainly is a process ongoing as we speak of engagement with the public service unions via the Public Services Committee, and that's what they're doing to get a fix on where people are, what people's thoughts are on that.
Okay, and James, can I just put one question to you before we finish up? You talked along the way in your presentation about, you know, hours becoming a sort of controlling mechanism now for the workforce. And then at the end you talked about maybe what we need to do is enforce the current regulations and so on. Do you think that the current regulations as they stand allow that problem to be checked and reformed?
Probably not. Probably not. But really what astonished me, I think, from the research that we did was the extent to which regulations, existing regulations, are not enforced. I used to think that, you know, in Ireland we were a fairly sort of clean society in those terms, you know, or that at least employment regulation will be broken in sort of small SMEs and that sort of place. What astonished me personally was the extent to which in all sorts of ways regulations which everybody knows are there are not enforced. And I think, and so that's my priority, if you like, if I had to have one, would be getting the employment protection, the laws of employment protection and the regulations around that actually enforced. To give you one simple example, it's quite widespread that people either don't get pay slips at all, or, and wait for it, that you have to pay to get a pay slip, right? I mean, let me repeat that. You have to pay to get a pay slip. What happens is that they will say, yeah, we'll send you your pay slip, but actually, of course, you get charged to your mobile phone, right? You know, now that's the idea that you have to be paid. You have to pay to get a pay slip. I mean, come on. These are sort of basic employment laws that are being broken, and it's becoming acceptable to break them. So let's get those things sorted out.
Okay, there are copies of the report at the very back of the room for people to take on their way out. We're due a short coffee break now, so we're going to take that and we'll come back for the next session afterwards. Can I finally ask you to thank our two speakers?
Thanks, Chair.